Pons is also known as metencephalon. It extends from the cranial end of the medulla oblongata to cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. The cranial nerves 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th are attached to it. Anteriorly, it is related to the clivus, laterally to the middle cerebral peduncle, and posteriorly to the fourth ventricle. Here in this diagram, you can see the region of the pons. Here you can see the upper border, the lower border, this anterior surface. This shows a basilar groove. This anterior surface shows this transverse striations which extends in the middle cerebral peduncle from the junction of the pons and middle cerebral peduncle. There emerges the trigeminal nerve by a sensory root and a motor root. Motor root lies medially and sensory root lies laterally. At the lower border, you see the emergence of abducent nerve, the facial nerve, and the vestibulocochlear nerve. External features. It is 5 cm in length. It has two surfaces, ventral and dorsal. Ventral surface is convex and is transversely striated. In the median plane, it shows a vertical groove which lodges basilar artery. Laterally, ventral surface is continuous with the middle cerebral peduncle. The trigeminal nerve is attached on the ventral surface at the junction of the pons with the cerebral peduncle. The nerve has a small motor root medially and a large sensory root laterally. The dorsal surface is hidden by cerebellum and forms the upper half of the floor of the fourth ventricle. The pons has two borders, superior and inferior. Here you can see the anterior surface and the posterior surface of the pons. Here in the anterior surface you can very well see it is convex, laterally having a superior border and inferior border, having transverse striations, continuous laterally with the middle cerebral peduncle. Here is the attachment of the fifth nerve, that is a trigeminal nerve, by two roots, a sensory root large, sensory root laterally, and a small motor root medially. The abducent nerve you can see at the junction of the pyramid and the lower border of pons. This seventh nerve at the junction of the olive and the pons and the vestibulocochlear nerve lateral here. This is the posterior surface of the pons forming the floor, upper part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. Here you can see this facial colliculus, the striamedullothalmi. At the superior border, crus cerebri are attached. The inferior border lies at the junction of pons and medulla oblongata. Abducent, facial, and vestibulocochlear nerves are attached at the inferior border. Internal structure. For the purposes of description, the internal structure is studied at two levels: superior level of the and a inferior level. The pons may be divided into a ventral part and a dorsal part known as tegmentum. The ventral part is continuous inferiorly with the pyramids of the medulla and on each side with the cerebellum through the middle cerebral peduncle. The dorsal tegmental part is a direct continuation of the medulla except the pyramids. Basilar part. The ventral portion has a basilar part is also known as ventral part. It has a uniform structure throughout its length. The gray matter in the region of the basilar part, it is represented by nuclei pontis, which are scattered among the longitudinal and transverse fibers. The pontine nuclei form an important part of the cortico-pontocerebellar pathway. Some of these nuclei get displaced during development and form arcuate nucleus and pontobulbar body. Fibers from all these nuclei go to the opposite half of the cerebellum. Here in this diagram you can see the basilar part is similar at all the levels, at the superior level and at the inferior level. There is a difference only in the dorsal tegmental part. The white matter consists of longitudinal and transverse fibers. The longitudinal fibers include the corticospinal and corticonuclear tracts, which are also known as pyramidal tracts. The corticopontine fibers are ending in the pontine nuclei. The transverse fibers are pontocerebellar fibers beginning in the pontine nuclei and going to the opposite half of the cerebellum through the middle cerebral peduncle. In this diagram, you can see the white fibers, the corticopontocerebellar fibers, they are running horizontally while these corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers, they are descending downwards among the transverse fibers. The pontocerebellar fibers pass to the contralateral side of the cerebellum through the massive middle cerebral peduncle. The corticospinal fibers appear as small and separate bundles running longitudinally between the fascicles of transverse pontine fibers. The tegmental part. The structure of the tegmental part differs in the upper and the lower part. Structure in the lower part of the pons. Here the special features in the gray matter are the presence of the abducent nerve nucleus, which lies beneath the facial colliculus. Number two, the facial nerve nucleus lies in the reticular formation of the pons. Here you can very well see the sixth nerve nucleus, or the abducent nerve nucleus, lying deep to the facial colliculus, while this facial nerve nucleus lies here in the reticular formation. Here you can see the facial nerve winds round the abducent nerve nucleus and emerges from the anterior aspect, lateral to the abducent nerve. This is the what you can see is the basilar part, and posterior, just posterior to the basilar part. Here you can see the tegmental part. You can see here the corpus trapezoidum is just immediately posterior to the basilar part. You can see the corpus trapezoidum Still posterior to the carpus trapezoidum, there lies lemnisci. From the medial to lateral, you find the medial lemniscus, the lateral lemniscus. Here, in this photograph, you can see how this facial nerve winds round the abducent nerve, forms a gene over here, which forms an elevation in the floor of the fourth ventricle known as facial colliculus and emerges here anterior from the ventral aspect of the pons at the lower border. Here you can see the fifth nerve. In the upper part you can see the fifth nerve is the sensory nucleus. This is the motor nucleus lies medially and sensory nucleus lies laterally. The vestibular and cochlear nuclei lie in relation to the inferior cerebral peduncle. The vestibular nuclei lie deep to the vestibular area in the floor of the fourth ventricle, partly in the pons and partly in the medulla. They are divisible in four parts: superior, inferior, medial, and lateral. They receive afferents from the vestibular nerve and efferents pass to cerebellum via vestibulocerebellar tract, the medial longitudinal bundle, and spinal cord through the vestibulospinal tract and lateral lemniscus. Here you can see the nuclei of the vestibular cochlear nerve, the vestibular nuclei having a superior, a lateral, a medial, and an inferior group. These vestibular nuclei they are very well connected here to the third and fourth nerves. The dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei are situated dorsal and ventral to the inferior cerebral peduncle. They receive afferents from the cochlear nerve and efferents pass mostly to the superior olivary nucleus and partly through corpus trapezoidum and to the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus. These fibers form the trapezoid body. The spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve lies in the lateral part. The superior olivary nucleus, superior salivatory nucleus, and lacrimal nucleus, they are also present at this level. Here in this line diagram, you can see the dorsal and the ventral nuclei of the cochlear nerve. The This is the dorsal acoustic area. Here you can see the ventral acoustic area. The efferents from the ventral nucleus they pass to the trapezoid body. They are connected here. Then this is the fibers going to the superior olivary nucleus, and the most of the fibers from the dorsal acoustic stria they go here in the lateral lemniscus. White matter. The trapezoid body or the corpus trapezoidum is a transverse band of fibers lying just behind the ventral part of the pons. It consists of fibers that arise in the cochlear nuclei of both sides. It is a part of auditory pathway. The medial lemniscus forms a transverse band on either side of the midline, just and the trapezoid body. It is joined by anterior spinothalamic tract. The lateral spinothalamic tract, also known as the spinal lemniscus, lies lateral to the medial lemniscus. The trigeminal lemniscus conveys fibers of the second order sensory neurons from the opposite spinal and sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. The inferior cerebellar peduncle lies lateral to the floor of the fourth ventricle. The fibers of the facial nerve follow a peculiar course. They first pass backwards and medially to reach the medial side of the abducent nucleus. Then they form a loop dorsal to the abducent nucleus. This loop is responsible for producing an elevation, the facial colliculus, in the floor of the fourth ventricle. Here in this photograph, you can see how this facial nerve nucleus and this facial nerve that winds around the sixth nerve nucleus forms a loop in the fourth ventricle, that is the facial colliculus, and then it emerges from the ventral aspect. The tegmentum in the upper part of the pons, the gray matter. The spatial features of the gray matter are here the presence of motor and superior sensory nucleus of trigeminal nerve. The motor nucleus is medial to the superior sensory nucleus. Here in this diagram you can see this is the sensory nucleus, this is the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Here in this diagram you can see if you examine it from the inner surface side, you can see here the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve lies medially, the sensory nucleus is lying laterally. This large sensory nucleus, superior sensory nucleus large, and this is the mesencephalic nucleus. The two nucleus join and the sensory root and the motor root emerges separately from the ventral aspect of the pons. As you can see the motor root, here you can see the sensory root. White matter. Immediately behind the ventral part, there are bands of white fibers made up from medial to lateral side of medial lemniscus, the spinal lemniscus, and the lateral lemniscus. The spinal lemniscus carries anterior and lateral spinothalamic tracts. The anterior spinothalamic tract carries information about crude touch and crude pressure. The lateral spinothalamic tract conveys sensations of pain and temperature. Here in this transverse section, you can very well see the medial lemniscus, the trigeminal lemniscus, the spinal lemniscus, and the lateral lemniscus. And here you can see the fifth nerve arising. There is the new mesencephalic nucleus. Here is the motor nucleus, and here is the sensory nucleus. Then here you can see the medial longitudinal bundle. Here is the tectospinal tract, and here is the rubrospinal tract. They are present in the medial part here of the tegment. From anterior to posterior, if you see, it is the rubrospinal tract, the tectospinal tract, and the medial longitudinal bundle. The trigeminal lemniscus contains the fibers arising in the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and traveling to the thalamus. The lateral lemniscus is a part of auditory pathway. It is formed by the fibers arising in the nuclei lying in close relation to the trapezoid body, that is the superior olivary nucleus and nucleus of the trapezoid body. The superior cerebral peduncle lies dorsolateral to the fourth ventricle. The medial longitudinal bundle is made up of fibers that interconnect the nuclei of the oculomotor, the trochlear, the abducent, vestibulocochlear, and spinal root of the accessory nerve. It coordinates with the movements of the head and neck in response to the stimulation of the vestibulocochlear nerve. However, the majority of the fibers in the medial longitudinal bundle arise in the vestibular nuclei. Here in this diagram, you can see that this medial longitudinal bundle is the ascending fibers, there is the descending fibers, and it is connecting the third nerve, the fourth nerve, the sixth nerve, the eighth nerve, superior cerebral peduncles. In the rostral part of the pons, the superior cerebral peduncles form the lateral walls of the fourth ventricle. The thin superior medullary velum is spanning between them to form its roof. The superior peduncles contains some cerebral afferent fibers, the ventral spinocerebellar tract, which carries proprioceptive information from the limbs. Here in this photograph, you can see the superior cerebral peduncles. You can see it is as they approach the midbrain, they converge between the two superior cerebral peduncles. There is superior medullary connecting. There is a superior medullary velum, which is a thin sheet of gray matter forming the roof of the fourth ventricle, and this uh, superior cerebral peduncles they are forming the superolateral boundary of the fourth ventricle, while the inferior boundary here of the fourth ventricle is formed by the inferior cerebral peduncles, the uh, tubercle cuneatus, and tubercle fasciculi. Superior cerebral peduncle consists mainly of the ascending cerebral fiber efferents concerned with the coordination of the movements that are destined for the red nucleus of the midbrain and ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The superior cerebral peduncles converge towards the midline as they pass into the midbrain. Blood supply. The pontine arteries are a number of small branches which arise at right angles from the basilar artery and supply the pons and adjacent part of the brain. The veins drain into the inferior petrosa sinus and basilar plexus of veins. Here in this diagram you can see the basilar artery giving the pontine branches supplying to the pons. It also gives the anterior cerebral artery, inferior cerebral artery, and superior cerebral artery. Here you can see the these are the pontine branches. Clinical anatomy. Number one, and most important is the pontine hemorrhage. It has following features. That is the bilateral. It presents with the bilateral paralysis of face and limbs due to the involvement of facial nerve, nucleus, and all corticospinal fibers. There is deep coma due to the damage of reticular formation. There is hyperpyrexia due to the cutting of the temperature fibers of the thalamus. There is pinpoint pupil due to the damage of sympathetic ocular fibers. This pontine hemorrhage is usually fatal. The second area of interest is the cerebellopontine angle. The structures present in the cerebellopontine angle include the choroid plexus of fourth ventricle, the flocculus, facial and vestibulocochlear nerves. A tumor, usually the acoustic neuroma in this angle, usually arises usually in relation to the vestibulocochlear nerve. It presents with ipsilateral facial paralysis and loss of taste in the anterior two-thirds of the tongue and hyperacusis due to the damage of the fibers of facial nerve. Then deafness and vertigo due to the damage of both parts of vestibulocochlear nerve. Then ataxia on the affected side due to the involvement of the flocculus. Then absence of the corneal reflex on the side of the lesion due to the damage of nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, including its spinal tract. Then, then there are a few very important syndromes. First is the Miller-Buckler syndrome. In this condition, there is damage to the fibers of abduction nerve along with the pyramidal fibers. It presents with the ipsilateral facial paralysis to the damage of the facial nerve, the, the ipsilateral loss of abduction of eyes due to the damage to the abduction nerve, and contralateral hemiplegia to the lesion of the pyramidal tracts. Here you can see the Miller-Buckler syndrome. This diagram is showing. You can see there is a paralysis. There is a partial or incomplete paralysis of the opposite side of the body to the damage of the pyramidal tract. Then paralysis of the rectus, lateral rectus on the same side is involved. The sixth, the lesion at emerging facial nerve leads to the ipsilateral lower motor neuron type of facial paralysis. The lesion of the emerging fifth cranial nerve results to the paralysis of muscles of mastication of the same side. Then the lateral pontine syndrome, very common of them is Mary-Fox syndrome. Due to the vascular involvement of basilar artery, usually the long circumficial are involved, or the anterior inferior cerebral artery. Lesions occur in the lateral pons, including middle cerebral peduncle. It presents with ipsilateral cerebral ataxia due to the involvement of the cerebral tract, contralateral hemiparesis due to the corticospinal tract involvement, then variable contralateral hemihyperesthesia of pain and temperature due to the spinothalamic tract. Here you can see the area of involvement of the Pons in the lateral medullary syndrome, and you can very well appreciate that here it is the facial nerve is involved. There is involvement of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve, the spinothalamic tract, in the involvement of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Tumors of the pons. Most common is the astrocytoma of the brainstem. Signs and symptoms vary according to the area of origin of the tumor. Development. Pons develops from the cranial metencephalic part of the rhombencephalic fascicle. Cells of the lamina migrate to form pontine nuclei, cochlear and vestibular nuclei, and sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The basal plate neuroblast give rise to the abducent nucleus, facial nucleus, and motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, and superior salivatory nucleus. Here you can see the alar plate, the basal plate. Alar plate gives rise to the sensory nuclei, while the motor plate gives rise to the motor nuclei. Motor nuclei, they include the sixth nerve, the seventh nerve, the superior salivatory nucleus. So that is all about the pons, its external features, internal features, its uh, clinical anatomy and development.